And what time do we end?
Whenever you're done, whenever you have one.
Okay.
Okay. So, good afternoon, everybody. Thank you for coming. And I'd like to introduce to you Professor Stanley Engerman. He's an economist and an economic historian at this department. He's best known for his work on slavery. In particular, in his book, Time on the Cross, he establishes that slavery had remained an efficient institution in the United States, and the book won the Bancroft Prize in American History in 1976. And Professor Engerman also is known for studying new colonies and studying the effect of natural resources on the long-term economic development of the new colonies. And Professor Engerman is a past president of the Economic History Association and the Social Science History Association, and he's a member of the American Academy of Arts and Sciences. So Professor Engerman graduated from the Medicine High School, and other notable graduates are Gary Becker and Robert Solow. So he got a very good training in that high school. Afterwards, he
Supreme Court Justice Ruth Bader Ginsburg also was a Madison graduate.
I see. So after that, Professor Engerman graduated from the New York University with bachelor's degree in business administration, not computer science, and master's degree also in business administration. And then in 1962, he graduated from Johns Hopkins University with doctorate in economics, and he was hired by the Department of Economics in 1963, where he has remained since then. And Professor Engerman has received a Guggenheim Fellowship, as well as fellowships from the National Science Foundation and the National Endowment for the Humanities, and he was elected Pitt Professor of American History and Institutions at the University of Cambridge in 1998-1999. And Professor Engerman is known to his colleagues for his generosity with his time in discussing their work. He's known for his encyclopedic knowledge of the golden age of Hollywood. And without further ado, Professor Engerman will talk to us about his work. So, lights, camera, action.
Well, I thought rather than just talk about my work, what I would do is to present a little bit of the background of the city of Rochester, because it might help you as you drive around to know what the famous locations are. May help you when visitors come passing through, for you to explain what buildings, statues, and so forth are, and just get a feel for the background of Rochester. Rochester was settled very early. It was settled just about the time of the American Revolution. It had been an area which had a fair Native American population, but starting after the Revolution, with the Genesee River as sort of the base, the area became settled by mainly people moving in from New England. Now, the local landmark, which is most important here, is the Erie Canal, which you pass through numerous times driving. You should note that part of the canal is not the original canal, but wasn't built until 1920. Of course, the canal used to go through the center of the city. Once automobiles came in and people had traffic, the downtown, the canal was moved from the downtown to the Genesee Valley Park, about 3 or 4 miles removed. But other than that, it's basically the original canal, which goes back to 1817. Now, the Erie Canal was very pivotal for the history not only of Rochester, but also for New York City and for New York State. The Erie Canal, after the Revolution, people started to settle various parts of the Midwest, Ohio. it became very desirable for a certain number of areas to try to tap the traffic which would be coming in from the Midwest. And you had about 6 or 7 different cities competing. You had Montreal, Boston, New York, Philadelphia, Baltimore, and Washington, all trying to come up with public works to tap the traffic which was coming in from Ohio, Indiana, and so forth. This is the most successful by far, indeed the only successful one, was the Erie Canal. The Erie Canal was built starting in 1817. It was built, completed in 1825, and it was able to tap into Lake Erie at Buffalo. The canal ran roughly from Albany. The Hudson River started at New York City. At Albany, the canal took over and ended up in Buffalo, which was on Lake Erie. And this was by far the most successful public work probably in American history. And what it did was to make New York City a major port, a major trading center, but it also helped Buffalo, Rochester, and so forth. Now, there's a little bit of a background to the route of the canal, which has a bit of a tint of corruption, which is not unique for public works, is that the original public work built was attempting to tap the Midwest, would be a trip along the St. Lawrence Seaway toward Montreal, and then just north of what would be Syracuse, come down to Syracuse, and then cut across on the Mohawk River. The reason this was a preferred route initially is because it had made the maximum use of water, which was cheap, and it also meant that it basically would be cheaper because the actual route required much less cost, much less overland, and did alternative routes. However, there was a bit of corruption, which actually was a very good thing in this case, in that the Holland Land Company, the land company which owned most of western New York and had since very early with the Dutch settlement, bribed the various congressmen of the state to shift the route to an overland route, which is a route the Erie Canal now follows. So in other words, what it did was to cut through a lot of unsettled land, and therefore it turned out to be this, even though there was corruption involved because they had paid the congressman to shift the route, what it did was to open up a tremendous amount of farmland in New York State, which wouldn't have been opened otherwise. So the Erie Canal was responsible for a lot of traffic. It was also responsible for a lot of new settlement, very valuable land. Still, actually, some of the land in this area is still farmed, though not as profitable as it used to be. Now, the nature of the Erie Canal was, as I say, you took the goods, came from Lake Erie, went through Buffalo, went through Rochester, Syracuse, went to Albany, and then shifted along the Hudson River. And this, as I say, was by far the most profitable of the public works, and it really is what was responsible for New York City being the major commercial capital of the United States for, well, a long time, probably still is. There was a little hints of corruption in the construction of the canal, because they had to hire workmen to dig the canal and so forth. And once the state legislature investigated and wanted to know why all the contracts for the construction went to the friends, relatives, and business associates of the people giving out the contracts, which was happened to be true too. So it's interesting that even in those days, there was a fair amount of corruption in public works. But, and as I say, the original corruption of the way you built the route was really, that was a masterstroke, and that actually was very successful. It was very successful in the 1820s to 40 period. Rochester was a major farming area for the country. It was the largest producer of wheat and grainstuffs in the country before grain production moved to the Midwest. So a lot of the early income and development of Rochester came about as a grain producer and benefiting from shipping along the Erie Canal. Now, the next point I want to discuss is something more along my own research, is a question of slavery in New York State and who are the leading players in slavery. Now, all the states in the United States had slavery from the very beginning. In fact, indeed, most of the rest of the world had slavery at the time too. I mean, slavery turns out to be rather ubiquitous. It's not just in the American South. New York State did have a certain number of slaves. A lot of them were doing construction work in New York City, and some of the bones actually of the people who were doing the construction work were dug up about 10 or 15 years ago. There was a big fight about whether you bury them in the black cemetery or not. But you had about 10,000 slaves in New York. Now, the northern states in the U.S. ended slavery, or purported to end slavery, and New York passed legislation to end slavery in 1789. But what ending slavery, 1799 rather, what ending slavery in that time meant is that nobody who was a slave at that time was freed. Everyone who was a slave as of 1799 remained a slave. Anyone who was born after that date, after a certain date, 1799, that person was considered to be born free, legally free. However, they owed the mother's owner a period of time from 18 to 25 years, depending on gender, of work as an apprentice for the slave owner. So in other words, even though they were technically free population, they were still bound as apprentices for a long period of time. The reason for doing that was a very clever device. Number one, what it meant is if a slave worked for 18 to 25 years, going back to some of the discussion, some of the pictures in labor economics, that basically for the first few years he would just be fed by the owner and taken care of. Well, the owner would take his mother's money and pass it on to him. But basically at the beginning, the slave would be supported. Then after about age 8 or 9 in those days, till whatever the age of ending slavery was, that the slave would be producing, but he would be exploited, that the owners would be able to take whatever the slave produced, he would have to allow a certain amount of consumption, and so forth. Now, so clever were the legislators in New York State that they had worked out very detailed calculation of how long it would take before the slave repaid his rearing cost, when the slave covered the cost of raising himself. And basically the number they picked for the number of years of slavery was that of apprenticeship was something which was guaranteed, or hopefully would cover the cost of raising the slave. This meant, of course, that the owner didn't have to pay anything to free the slave. The owner was able to recover his costs by the slave's production. Secondly, what it also meant was that the taxpayers of the state didn't have to pay anything to free the slaves. They didn't have to buy the slaves, as happened in some other countries and so forth. Basically, the slave owner was compensated by the slave in terms of working, and the taxpayers paid nothing, which, of course, helped get the legislation to free the slaves somewhat more acceptable. There was a change in 1817. New York State was one of the few states which passed legislation saying anyone who had been a slave in 1799 would become free in 1827. So in other words, slavery, the last slave, the last apprentice in New York is 1827. In New Jersey and Pennsylvania, actually, they never passed laws changing that, so you had slaves existing to 1850 and a bit later. But the big device was you freed the slave, and this turns out worldwide to be the most frequent means of freeing slaves. You force a slave as an apprentice, not as a slave, to work for 18, 20, up, Pennsylvania was up to 30 years, and therefore to pay the cost of raising himself and freeing the taxpayers from any burden. So slavery did die out in New York after 1827, but it took quite a while, even after they passed legislation against it. The next important changes which occurred are a series of moral changes which occurred, particularly in upstate New York, but also elsewhere. This was known at the time as the burnt-over district. The burnt-over district meant that this was an area which had a very high degree of emotion, was very concerned with sort of aid to women, to slaves, and so forth, that this was an area in which abolition became very important, and also the women's movement basically started in Rochester and around Rochester. For the women's movement, the key woman is Susan B. Anthony, who is sort of regarded as the founder of women's movement in the 1830s. Her house is somewhere in the 19th Ward. They refurbished it, and it's basically a sort of museum now. Also, Susan B. Anthony is buried, one of the many people buried in Mount Hope Cemetery. Mount Hope Cemetery was, at the time it was built in the 1840s, was a very, one of the few cemeteries which was meant to be a picnic ground. It was not, it was meant to be an area, a park and so forth. People had strange ideas, or it seemed strange, of what a cemetery should be like. And after Mount Auburn in Boston, you had Mount Hope, which was, as I say, was intended to be a area which people would picnic, park, and so forth. That's why if anyone walks in the funeral in the cemetery, you notice in the middle of the cemetery there's a pond. That pond is left over from the early days of construction because people wanted to bring together life and death or whatever. Well, Susan B. Anthony is, her other Rochester connection is buried in the Mount Hope Cemetery. Also buried is another leader of the women's movement, Elizabeth Cady Stanton. So, I mean, some of the leaders of the movement came from Rochester, were very important in all the agitation, and they remained in Rochester as their base of operations. As they say, I forget exactly where, but the Susan B. Anthony House is a museum. It's somewhere in the 19th Ward. But more important, I shouldn't say more important, but important also was Rochester became a center of abolitionism, a center of the movement against slavery. That many of the early abolitionists resided in Rochester, wrote in Rochester, and again, we're using Rochester as a base to advocate emancipation of slaves and of slavery. This early abolitionism served to attract probably the most famous slave in American history to Rochester. Frederick Douglass had been a slave in Maryland. He was a slave who first he worked in agriculture. Second, he worked as a basically longshoreman in the docks of Baltimore. But Douglass was a very unusual slave in that he was one of the few slaves who successfully ran away and ran to the north. He was also a slave who had been educated by one of his owners, and he was a literate slave and so forth. And he was picked up, adopted in many ways by the abolition movement, the leading abolitionists, because he was able to write, to talk about it. And he has, well, he wrote a lot, as we'll see. But Douglass came to Rochester at the start of the 1850s, and he owned and operated a newspaper, an abolition newspaper, the North Star. And this was sort of his basis of leading an attack on slavery, which he then continued by writing several autobiographies and lots of newspaper articles and so forth. But Douglass was probably, because of his literacy and just general intelligence, probably becomes the most famous slave in American history. He also keeps writing until about the 1870s and 80s. He's ambassador to Haiti. He's a confidant with Lincoln about having black troops and working out the Black Army, which is in the movie You've Seen It Glory, is about the case, but Douglass was instrumental there. And he was just, wrote a large number of talks, all advocating abolition and so forth. So Douglass, as I say, was in Rochester for a period of time. He was in Rochester, as I say, running his newspaper, and this became a center. Rochester was also at the time a center of the so-called Underground Railroad. The Underground Railroad was not underground. The Underground Railroad was basically slaves working their way north and escaping from whites, policemen, white owners, and so forth. The Underground Railroad accounted for a fair number of the slaves who were able to escape. It was called underground because presumably it was a secret method, and as I say, Rochester still has one or two sites which reflect the Underground Railroad. Douglass is, well, as I say, has 3 autobiographies, all of them written at different times of his life. It's probably his most famous collection. Now, the Douglass family actually still lives in the 19th ward. They were a great-grandson or something like that who, when I wrote the book on slavery, the grandson wrote, or great-grandson, whatever, wrote me a letter just to say hello, to remind us that the Douglass family still has a presence. There's also an attempt, following the Susan B. Anthony house, to have a Frederick Douglass house reconstructed and so forth. that financing isn't going very well. Now, there are a few signs of Douglass still in Rochester. There are several statues of Frederick Douglass, often presented by the black community. Several statues which are in prominent places around town. If you walk through Highland Park, near the amphitheater, the statue there is Frederick Douglass. It was moved from somewhere downtown more recently, but that is one of the Douglass statues. There's another Douglass statue which is somewhat more perhaps more interesting. A Douglass statue opposite the bookstore, and the Douglass statue is, it used to be by the main entrance of the bookstore. That's what it is now. But the Douglass statue has an interesting history. The statue was given to Douglass in the 1870s and 80s by the black community as a symbol of their gratitude. What then happened was it got buried somewhere in the university with the racial civil rights discussion of the 1960s. People picked up the Douglass statue and moved it onto campus as sort of part of the civil rights gestures at the university. The initial problem was, if you've seen the statue, you know it's pure white marble. And a number of people got very upset that you had a statue of Douglass, but it's all white. Doesn't seem right. Well, it turned out that the statue had been given to him by the black community. So they were able to sort of keep using this white statue. Just shows the preferences of people for statuary at the time. But there was a series of small disturbances because of the whiteness. And there are several other statues scattered around town of Frederick Douglass, the leading abolitionist. There's also, within Mount Hope Cemetery, Frederick Douglass, the tombstones, the burial place of Frederick Douglass, his two wives, his children, and so forth. It's very close to Mount Hope. There's a map that you can find it. But anyhow, you have a family plot of about 6 or 7 of the Douglass family buried there. It's one of the interesting things about the burial is that there are actually 2 Frederick Douglass tombstones. One tombstone given by the black community, one tombstone given by the white community. Seems straightforward, however, reflecting the fact that no one seemed to be certain about the date of birth of a slave. They have 2 different birth dates. They're only a year apart, so it's not egregious, but you know, as you go there, you'll notice, if you do wander through the cemetery, you will notice that there are 2 tombstones for Frederick Douglass, and that's sort of the basis of the different parts of the community. And as I say, Douglass is still a presence. The Frederick Douglass Institute on campus was named after the most famous Rochester black slave and so forth. And so as I say, they're still trying to raise money for Frederick Douglass House, but that's been rather unsuccessful relative to Susan B. Anthony. But Douglass was the leading black abolitionist, the leading figure. He, as I say, lived and published here for 10 years, and actually remained here. Well, then he lived in Washington for a while, but then was buried here. Now, Douglass, I've often quoted because Douglass has an interesting analysis of what's bad about slavery. What sense it's obvious. But his claim was that his master fed him well, took good care of him, but that wasn't essential. What was bad about slavery is that he couldn't talk to who he wanted to, he couldn't go where he wanted to, he couldn't work where he wanted to. Basically, it was a loss of freedom, the ability to choose what to do. That was bad about slavery, irrespective of how badly or not he was being fed. So he had some interesting descriptions of what it meant to be a slave, which are still, they still in many ways, those who work in the subject, still worth quoting because it gets away from the question of material treatment as such, but just the freedom, the ability to move, and so forth. Douglas was once asked after he went to Ireland during the famine whether the Irish were slaves. His answer basically was that the Irish weren't slaves, were not slaves. The Irish did have it tough, but they could walk where they want to, talk to who they want to, they could bring suit against who they want to, all rights which a slave didn't have. Douglas also got in trouble with Susan B. Anthony in the women's movement because he commented that marriage may somehow seem something like slavery to some women, but basically it was a question of choice. You had voluntary decisions. So Douglas, even though he was active somewhat in the women's movement, was not as strong an advocate as many of the women thought he should be, basically because of the ability to choose. Now, I just want to close up by describing a few of the famous other people in Rochester. The most famous one, still probably the most famous businessman, is George Eastman. His house where he lived all his adult life was 800 East Avenue. Eastman hit it lucky. He came up with photographic discoveries. He came up with the idea of a small camera, and Eastman became one of the wealthiest people in the country. It was a tremendous device which he had. It's an interesting, the photographic industry's interest because it's an industry which could have located anywhere. He located in Rochester because that's where he's from. And Eastman, as I say, died a very wealthy man. He's buried in his own house, not in Mount Hope. Eastman was responsible for founding the medical school here, for financing med school. And then at some point, as he aged and felt bitter, he committed suicide. But it's still, as you can see around Rochester, there's still a very big presence of Eastman, Eastman Kodak, and so forth. Now, being somewhat more frivolous, there are certain other Rochester connections which we can bring to your attention. Number one, if you've seen the movie Spellbound with Ingrid Bergman and Gregory Peck, it's one of Hitchcock's movies about a psychiatrist and so forth. This film stars Ingrid Bergman. And at the time the movie was made, Ingrid Bergman was married to a doctor who was an intern at Strong Hospital. And so in the middle of the movie, wherever Ingrid Bergman is going somewhere to travel, she's going to Rochester. Rochester, the name Rochester surfaces several times in the movie. Probably about the only movie which does have Rochester in it. There are other famous movies, but there are some famous, one very famous star who lived in Rochester for many years, and this is a famous German actress, rather exotic actress called Louise Brooks, who was rediscovered by the head of the Eastman photography thing, and she became a bit of a cult figure. She made some very famous movies more in Germany than in the US, but Louise Brooks actually became the focus of several books and a lot of publicity for Rochester, even though it's just that she had nowhere else to live, somebody had to move here and so forth. Also important as far as the movie industry is concerned is Humphrey Bogart's mother is from Rochester, or was from Rochester. But there's also another famous mother from Rochester, and that's Winston Churchill's mother, who came from Rochester, was raised in Rochester, and so forth. So there are some, for Bogart, Churchill, Louise Brooke, Ingrid Bergman, there's no great landmarks, it's just that people remember them. Although if you see Spellbound, it does have a train, and it has a right train going to Rochester, actually. But that's because, as I say, her husband at the time was an intern at Strong. Now, are there any other movies which we're missing?
Well, there is It's a Wonderful Life, and in the beginning there is a conversation between George and Mary on the phone, and they're talking to the boyfriend of Mary at the time,
Yeah.
and he's thinking of locating a factory somewhere, and he's thinking of locating it in Rochester. And then George, Jimmy Stewart's character, asks him, why of all the places in Rochester, why not right where they live?
So it's a second moment of film glory.
Yes.
But George then makes a lot of money, but it's not by producing in Rochester, I think.
No, that he gets some donations in the end of the movie, right?
Yeah.
But that involved no production of material goods.
But other than that, I can't think of any other connections. But there was a famous moment, I think, when Churchill's mother died, and the local headline was "Rochester Woman Dies," to establish the credentials. But as I say, my work in general has been along, well, I've been working on two projects. I'll just include, one is, for a very long time, the history of slavery. And it began with the history of slavery in the American South, but then became a study of slavery elsewhere in the Americas. And now it's just generally, since slavery was worldwide, studying the different characteristics of slavery in different parts of the world, why slavery started, it's easy to figure out because you exploit people, but also why slavery ended, why does it take until the late 19th century before you have large-scale slavery. The second project I've been working on is a project which starts from the proposition, which is true, that down to about 1700, the richest part of the Americas was Mexico and South America. These were the richest parts. They had about 75% of the entire Native American population. They had very sophisticated societies, and the Aztecs and the Incas. The part which becomes the United States only has about 2 or 3% of all the Native Americans, very unpopular. The first area which people go to when they settle, Spain. Spain has a 100-year lead over everybody else. They obviously go to Mexico and Peru, where all the wealth is and all the people are. No one is very anxious to go to North America, basically because Native Americans certainly didn't find it prosperous. The French argued no area north of 40 degrees latitude had ever gotten rich, so why bother going there? So the French didn't want to go into Canada. So, you know, starting down from the settlement period, even before, because of the Native Indians, the populations and the wealth slowly drifts over time, that by after 1700, by 1800 and 1900, South America has an income only about 25% the income of North America. In other words, you have a very sharp break, but it doesn't occur until after 1700. The first 200 years were quite rich. So the question which we were studying was what difference, what accounts for this great difference? Why do we have a case where down to 1700, South America and Latin America are rich, and after that, North America, which no one wanted to settle beforehand, becomes a rich area and ultimately becomes a very profitable area. And the argument we made briefly is that a lot of this has to do with the question of climate, natural resources, and so forth. And basically, the climate affects what crops can be grown. The nature of the crops that can be grown affects the production technology and income distribution, which will follow. And that by looking at climate and geographic factors, one could explain, as we hope we've done, to explain why Latin America, which had a climate which made it very productive to have sugar plantations and mining, have very large-scale units, compared to North America, which can only grow wheat on small units. Why does the climate affect the technology, affect the crops, and what are the crops selected affect ultimately the income distribution and political power. Latin America, South America today is still considered to be that part of the world which has the most unequal income distribution. It's a carryover from the early settlement. US and Canada are among the more equal, again having to do with the initial settlement, the initial crop patterns and so forth. And so this is sort of what we've done is to finish off some work dealing with what effect these different climates had on the voting patterns in different societies, the education, the taxes, the monetary systems, and so forth. And, you know, with a few caveats, we link it all back to the initial settlement and initial climate, initial crop. Sugar is only grown in large scale. Wheat generally down to 1940s on small scale. And so we're trying to, as I say, explain partly why Latin America was rich at the beginning, but more importantly, why it ultimately gets very poor and North America becomes richer. So those are the two projects I work on, mainly the slavery project has always had some New York connection. This other connection doesn't really fit into Rochester.
Any questions? So one question I have, how does the work of Esemoglu and Robinson relate to your projects? They explain everything with the colonial institutions. And if there was a role for initial conditions, it was that they affected who settled where,
Yeah.
and what kinds of colonial institutions were established.
Yeah, no, there's, we both come up with the same answers. What they do is they emphasize the effect of mortality on settlement. That their emphasis is on that people didn't go where they would be dying, they would go where they would live longer. The Caribbean areas, which became heavy sugar producers, there's a lot of people dying, so That's not settled by whites, that's settled by blacks, and so forth. Our argument is basically not so much that the mortality, although the answers will come out similar, is depends on what the crop conditions are, what crops can be grown. Now, it just so happens that wheat is grown in temperate zones, which have very high life expectation. Sugar is grown in tropical zones, which have lower life expectation. But basically, we like to emphasize the climate and the crop as conditioning. They emphasize more the, not the crop, but the mortality. But as I say, it's hard to disentangle. The temperate zones are wheat producing, and they're producing with high rates of life expectation. So, you know, there's, as all scholars and economists do, there's a good deal of excessive differentiation of product all over the place. But I think it's basically a very consistent pattern that we just like to emphasize the ability to plant and grow crops.
Mm-hmm. I have another question about slavery.
Yeah.
So in your book you point out that given how profitable slavery was, it's not surprising that it took a civil war to abolish slavery.
Yeah.
And what's more surprising is why it did not take violence in other places to abolish slavery.
Yeah.
So how come abolition was so peaceful elsewhere?
Okay, abolition would have been exceptionally expensive in the U.S. The total value of the slave population in 1850, in 1860, and, you know, at the end, was roughly equal to 1 year's gross national product. So any attempt to compensate for slaves to pay back the owners would not have, would have been prohibitively expensive. It would have meant at least a doubling or tripling of the budget, federal budget and so forth. Now, it turns out that of all the major slave powers in the world, the U.S. is the only one which had an uncompensated emancipation. You couldn't compensate because once you start a war with 600,000 people killed, you're not going to pay off the Southerners for this. But just about all the other countries had different forms of compensation. The British had a dual system of compensation. They paid to the slave owners an amount equal to, say, roughly 50% of the value of the slaves. And then they forced the owners, the slaves, to work for 4 to 6 years for their owners, which equaled roughly the amount of the cash grant. So as far as the British do, they end slavery with a payment of 100% to the slave owners. Just about all the countries, Dutch, the French, the Swedes, who had 900 slaves, all paid compensation. The amazing thing, which is always striking when you look at it, is that all the slaves and all the serfs, of course serfdom ended in Europe at roughly the same years, in all cases except for the U.S. basically, the slave owners, serf owners were compensated. In no case at all were slaves ever, or serfs, ever compensated. Basically, what they did was they say, you have property rights and slaves, we have to compensate you for the loss of your property, and that's how they did it. But basically, as one thinks it through, I mean, the discussion of reparations in the U.S. doesn't really arise until the about 1900 is when it begins, and so that discussion does come, but it's much later. A few crazy abolitionists advocated paying the slaves money when they freed them, But basically, all the arguments were that you have to compensate owners, you don't have to compensate slaves. So that's why the U.S. is unusual. And the U.S. was unusual because the relative amount of the value of slaves compared to national income was considerably higher than elsewhere. U.S. had the largest slave population. It also had a very high price for slaves. So it would have been impossible to compensate. And so it was never really discussed in the U.S. For those who read some of the literature about writings of Ezzy Domo and so forth, there's an interesting argument made by Abe Lincoln in 1858 as part of the debate. Lincoln had a very strange policy to end as an abolitionist. He was against slavery, he didn't like slavery, but he also knew politically what could be done. So he said the way to end slavery is, number one, don't touch slavery where it existed. Those states which have slaves now, let them keep their slaves. We won't do that. What we want to do is not let slavery expand. In other words, the various parts of the frontier where they were starting to move slaves to, Lincoln said, we won't let them move into those areas. So again, he's not freeing any slaves, he's just not letting slaves move. He's asked then what will happen. And he says, well, if the slave population grows as rapidly as it has, as it will, and if the amount of land which the slaves have to work will not increase, in other words, of course, they can't move into the new territories, slavery would ultimately end, because as a population of slaves increases relative to land, what will happen is the value of slaves would fall, and slave prices ultimately would fall to zero. Lincoln's asked in 1858, when will this occur? His answer is, well, probably about 100 years. But that would be a better way to end slavery rather than have a war. But so the point was, there was no attempt even by abolitionists, people, pro-abolition people like Lincoln, of doing anything but sort of try to adjust the land-labor ratio to end slavery. That basically was just too expensive.
Yes, please.
I wonder if there is a link between the distribution of slavery between America or in other parts of the world with the development argument of crops or institutions. I mean, for institutional argument, having the most slavery in America most contradicts with those institutional arguments that those North countries or America or Europe has more democratic institutions. But I wonder if it has a link between those crops.
Yeah, the three major areas of slavery in the modern world are Brazil, which had first sugar and then coffee, so slave crops. The Caribbean, which had the great amount of sugar, and the U.S. South, which again had initially rice and tobacco, and then mainly cotton. What happens in many other societies is that slavery also is a plantation crop. For example, in the 1880s and 90s, you have slavery expanding within Africa for the cocoa trade and cocoa production. In Greece, in Rome, you've had olive plantations. So generally, there is often some large-scale crop, which means slavery is useful.
Yeah, but it seems that those crops using slavery does not lead to higher development and does not lead to welfare in those areas.
Well,
So,
it depends on what year you cut off. If you cut off in 1700, the South is doing very well. What happens, well, that's part of the story in this book we're doing, is that what happened when you had sugar and you know, the coffee in Brazil and so forth, is that the political system got very skewed. You had rich whites and poor either Native American Indians, as in parts of Latin America, or black slave labor. So basically the political situation which occurs in the areas with slaves is very different than North America. And this shows up in the question of what percent of the population can vote. In about 1900, about 20%, including women who don't vote, but just figure about 20% of the population of the US and Canada is voting. What's happening in Latin America is about 2% of the population is voting. In other words, so what happened, the whole voting system, which comes about because of the economies of scale in the crops, the whole voting system means that you have a rather strong political constraints in Latin America. And you know, part of it, roughly the same percentages will occur if you ask about education, because in the degree of education which evolves in the northern, in Canada and so forth, the degree of education is very high. The degree of education down to about sort of 1910 or so, the rate of education in most of Latin America is extremely low. So you do have the residue of the political system is that you don't get education. The banking systems differ completely. The banking system in the United States and Canada is you have a lot of small banks, which can then sort of deal with small businessmen. In Latin America, you have very few banks, and they're usually very big, and they're just to service the rich people or power. So I think there is, in this sense, there is a link between, it's an inverse, there is a link between what the crop is and what the political system ends up being. And that's sort of what the real story is, that the education in the U.S. is about 10 times higher than it is elsewhere.
Any other questions? Right, thank you very much, Professor Engerman. Thank you very much.
My pleasure.
Well, could you sign my book? Rather, your book, my copy of your book. Yes, excellent. Thank you very much.
Erie Canal and